pleasantries. Thank you to the judges for judging. It's late. You don't have to. Good friends, actually good friends on side up. And thank you to all the spectators in the audience. Ale, I sing your praises every round, every tournament. And
He does.
I'm not tired of it yet. Here's to a good rest of the year. Also, I would have really liked to have debated novice semis. This house regression Rocky Clocky is like
So
10 out of 10 debate. Very, very sad I couldn't. Very sad I couldn't. Cool. 3, 2. First, the philosophical argument. Note here that we tell you, in order for something to have an essence, necessarily something has to create that essence or create a concept of an essence that creates the person that will then exist. That is, for us to say that something has an essence before it has existence that can cultivate and mold that essence, something necessarily has to predetermine that essence. This is either a third order being, like a higher order being, like a concept of a god or something to that nature, or just a being that has higher capacity than humans. This is critical, because if we prove that there is no God or no being that can exist in this nature, necessarily then we also prove that essence cannot also exist. A couple of reasons why this is the case. One, there's no reason for the world to be constructed in the way that it is. It means that we can conceptualize of a greater good prior to any God's existence that is more encompassing of the world. Second, God of the gaps. Large part of the reason why we attribute things outside of ourselves, i.e. essence, is because we don't understand the capacities of the human mind. That is, over time, we learn more about it, and these types of gods disappear. Second, the problem of evil. That is, if there's something that creates an essence, that essence probably wants to be good, or have some conception that is good. We will tell you in case where there are reasons structurally why it will be bad, but secondarily, we tell you that if there is a problem of evil or a question of evil, the essence that is created prior necessarily is not true. Last, God, or this type of God, has never revealed himself to us. If God existed, it is unclear why he would not reveal himself. Lastly, the ontological argument, because if we cannot imagine a perfect God, we cannot create a clear and distinct image of thus God, thus there is no clear distinct being in the first place. But note very critically that this is all part of the debate, but the more important part of the debate, i.e. the narrative part of the debate, is how people perceive and interact around these narratives. Because notably, they can also get up and read great philosophical arguments about why essence is true, but the purpose of philosophy is to lead humans to some conception of the good life, or get them to the good life. The reason why we consider these types of questions that have existed for centuries is to guide us towards more meaningful forms of life and towards some abstract good. The reason why is simple. First, philosophy is endlessly complex, and anyone can find justifications for anything. That's why these debates exist in the first place and have not been resolved despite thousands of years of philosophizing, despite the fact that we're going to have a round philosophizing about which one is more correct. The second, the concept of philosophy only takes work in as much as they lead us towards something. We value the capital T truth because it helps us understand ourselves and the manner in which we ought orient ourselves towards the true world. Third, the question of this house supports, not this house believes, means this is not a debate about which fill is consistent or correct, but instead how the world perceives this fill and the interactions that are created if this is a dominant or accepted narrative. With that, two pieces of argumentation. The first, we have the best access to create positive action. We think that if we define essence over existence, we presume that we do have some sort of purpose, but also we presume we have some sort of set and ingrained type of life or society that is going to be enacted even if our existence cuts back against us. What does this mean, and why is this a problem? First, we struggle to endlessly find what our purpose actually is. These questions are often beyond our comprehension in many cases, which leads to people turning towards nihilism or despair. It makes the argument very clear. What happens if your essence is not something you agree with? What happens if you're unable to choose or are scared the thing you are choosing is not your essence? What happens when you are paralyzed by the decisions that you can make because you are scared of going against the essence that was created for you? What happens if you feel like you are failing your purpose? What happens if you do not know your purpose? All these are questions that are asked by essence, or all of these are questions that are asked on both sides of the house. So what is the uniqueness? Uniqueness is on our side of the house, we have the capacity to answer the question through our existence, through our actions, through the choices that we make. We are the arbiters of our own life and our own good. On their side of the house, there is necessarily a correct answer, but not only is there a correct answer, there's an answer that you cannot know, which creates a feeling of existential dread and nihilism within you, because you are scared and you are fearful. This is the same reason why we are fearful of death, because it is the unknown or the uncomprehendable. Similarly, we are fearful of essence because we think that we are predisposed to a life that we do not agree with or a life that we do not want. Second, there are simply vast differences in what everyone considers essence to be. These differences are not semantic, but in fact the reason for things like a religious conflict. That is, if each person perceives their existence as being defined in adherence to the laws of a certain God, or that a certain God created essence that then dictates existence, then you know these gods are different, there is a necessity for conflict. Note the uniqueness here. A necessary component of essence is who or what creates that essence, but secondarily, it is not true counterfactually through existence, because we can all define our own meaning through existence, which means that other meanings are not threatening or necessarily mutually exclusive. That is, even if it is the case that you have a theological reason that God exists, we tell you that the God can only ask you to do correct things in the existence, so your existence on our side of the house is the dominant action are dominant, predetermined for action. Whereas on their side of the house, necessarily people feel that if your essence is something that you're going against, that you will be fatwad, or that you are doing something wrong in the eyes of the greater creator, and you need to be punished for it. That is, there's an external mechanism on two people that acts as a coercive mechanism either through society or through the self, because you are scared of doing the wrong thing. Third, we doubt that our joy and harm, we doubt our joy and harm as being false emotions, hollow, because they do not necessarily reflect the truth. For example, if we define our essence as being important, winning the tournament is not worth it if it does not lead us to approach a more broader good. That is, before I entered this tournament, I kind of wanted to be Sodi, but now that I'm Toady in finals, I kind of don't know what I want anymore. And this is important, yes, and this is important because it means that I cannot feel the joy of being in finals and debating this motion right now. I cannot be sure that the joy that I am feeling, whether or not I win or lose this round, is necessarily reflective of my essence. I cannot be sure if I am making a harm that I cannot even know I am making, which makes me deeply sad and confused. It also makes us less likely to take actions that might bring us joy or sadness, and when we do these things, they are less joyful. That is, it's hard for us to find meaning in the things that create joy if those things can necessarily be against our essence or in asymmetry with our essence. Fourth, it is unlikely that people consider essence to be altruistic. Why is this the case? Because there is a couple of warrants. First, you question motivations for your altruism. Am I really just doing this selfishly and not fulfilling my essence, or does it help me bring meaning? It is, if I do something for others, is it because it is my essence to do so, or am I acting against my essence? Second, you will default to often biologically essentialist readings, since they are the easiest way to get around the existential question. That is, social Darwinism relied on the idea that the essence of humanity was greedy and necessarily stratified. This is incredibly important because it frames out how the society will look in a world that supports this narrative. That is, if people understand essence as existing, and deeply per the analysis we just gave you, want to create an answer for the existence, they will often default on narratives that have historical backing or narratives that are simple to them to understand, which is why people, for instance, opt into religion. It's very easy to understand that even though your death happens, you can go to a happy place in heaven, and you can still live happily and don't have to contend with actual fear of death. Similarly, then, for essence, people will look to things like biological essentialism, look at things like historical trends, look at things that say, you are X, you will do Y, that is how you describe value, that is your life. That, we think, is uniquely bad, especially at the point at which it is often asymmetrical with what people actually want themselves. On the counterfactual, why is the existence definition good? We think it leads people towards good works. If our actions do axiomatically define our lives, we don't have to question nearly as much what our motivations are, and whether helping meets true meaning, or whether altruism is biologically determined or defined. This very act of helping itself is where we derive our meaning, independent of whatever it derives, or etc., the feeling that we have. That is, if I want to be a good person, I will do good things, because I know that it is in my control to be a good person. However, on their side, maybe my essence is I'm a very bad person, and running that red light is just in line with what I was going to do anyway. Maybe it means I need to do more bad things. Maybe robbery isn't bad itself. Maybe the system of morals that we prescribe on humanity is out of flux because our personal essences are not the same as moral essences. Second, we feel fundamentally optimistic about our ability to change bad things when they happen. That is, people will inevitably make some form of mistakes in their actions. If they're essentialists, they will attribute that fundamental flaw within their nature. If they're existentialists, they will be further spurred towards action that rectifies and redefines it. Second, essence is used to reinforce socially negative outcomes, which Ollie will give you a lot more information about in MG.
Can someone run me down a USB-C charger?
I'll do it.
To USB to Lightning. To be clear. A couple pleasantries. Thanks y'all for coming out to judge, for staying up so late. Thanks Kaylee for TOing this tournament.
Sorry.
It's good to see some nice other Southern representation down here. I am so happy to be able to say true friends on side all. Ale, I don't know you very well, but I would like to know you a little bit better at some point. Ahmad, I had such a fun time debating with you at Hopkins. I'm glad that we can have another final round together, even if we're on opposite sides. Andrew, it has been such a joy to debate with you. I've enjoyed myself immensely, and I'm so glad to go out on a film motion with you. Thanks to the GW team. Thanks for not forcing me to punt finals and letting us get home at like 3 a.m. All right.
Wait, my spreadsheet. Yeah, it's now.
Do you need me to give you a second?
Yeah, I just have like 2 seconds, 3 seconds.
You can just copy straight from my flow now.
The problem is it just doesn't edit the spreadsheet.
Yeah, you can do it after my speech. Or during my speech.
Oh, okay, I got it. I'm good.
Okay. Everyone good? Thanks. Starting off. Overview. What is philosophically true is the only thing that matters in this round. Truth comes prior to the flow because in order to evaluate the flow, you must presuppose that truth exists. This means that truth claims ought to be the way that this round is evaluated. It is almost tautologically true. Also, no one gives a shit about abstract philosophical questions. They give this to you on case, so this does not impact the way that people actually live their lives. At that point, I don't think they actually gain any access. This is the same reason why my film major is going to be bullshit and make me no money, because no one gives a shit about the philosophical questions we're arguing about. Therefore, this debate is about truth testing. In order to prove that we ought to support something, Gov has to prove that it is factually true, otherwise we ought to take no position. Therefore, if we sow sufficient doubt in your mind that existence doesn't precede essence, then we win the round. Two independent arguments. First, God is real. Warrants for why. First, the ontological truth. A maximally great being must possess maximal amounts of attributes, which necessarily includes the existence as a property. It would be contrary to this conception of God to imagine that anything could place limits on the existence of God. If it is possible to conceive of such a being, then it must exist. If there exists a hypothetical world, A, that does not contain a maximally great being, or second, B, that with the maximally great being, then the non-existence of the world in A can't be determined by any fact about the world, since no contingent fact about the world would be able to constrain the existence of a maximally great being. The second argument is on cosmological fine-tuning. The odds of a universe suited for us to be able to exist is like 1 in 250 million billion, like infinitely cosmological fine-tuning. The only way for this to truly exist is for there to be something that creates us. There's like no world in which the Big Bang actually happens, so there must be a being that allows us to do this. Third, the argument of contingency. Nothing can come from nothing. This is the first law of thermodynamics. Everything must have a cause, and that means there must be an ultimate cause to the universe. All objects have necessary conditions that must be met for them to exist. My reading this LO depends on the air I breathe, the Wi-Fi connecting me to my flow, and any number of other factors. The presence of each contingent factor is in turn contingent on a number of external conditions being met. These conditions are independent of the objects themselves, so the existence of any contingent object requires the existence of external factors. This proves God is real because the existence of the universe is contingent on the existence of a causeless being. The contingent factors for the universe cannot be constrained within the universe itself. Therefore, God must exist if anything is to be real in the first place. Therefore, something must exist outside of human existence which will prove guides our essence. The fourth argument is on Pascal's wager. We ought presume God exists because there is infinite disutility to us not believing and having faith in God. Therefore, in this round, you pre-fiat as a judge ought just assume that God is real, because otherwise you're probably going to hell. Just assume the argument is true at that point. Subpoint B is how this just proves determinism. This is true, one, because Gov concedes this burden at the top. They say there must be some existence, like a God, that is giving us some level of essence in order to prove that essence exists and is prior to existence. Therefore, if we prove that God exists, there is something outside of human existence that is giving us essence. Second, if there is a God that exists, that has created the universe, that God necessarily knows exactly what is going to happen throughout all space and time. This means that there is some level of plan that exists, regardless of whether or not that God is actively engaging in some level of intervention in the world, doesn't matter insofar as there is some plan, that there must be some essence which we are working to, some end which we are moving towards. I think this round is over insofar as Gov just concedes that this is the burden for us to win the round. Second argument is on determinism. Couple warrants for why. First, there's no free will. Every thought must have a thought that causes it, but this is infinitely regressive. It means that there must be a stopgap, i.e., a thought that pops into existence without any prior rationalization for there to be any level of free will. This on its own proves that essence must come prior, because it necessarily means that what constitutes the base of an unrationalized substance of thought comes prior to the logic that follows from it. It also proves that It also proves logic incoherent because there's no first cause that is reasoning it. Instead, the words that I'm giving you right now came predetermined because of everything that happened in my life prior to this that has informed the fact that I got a philosophy degree and got Nathan Parker's blocks on why God is real, right? What that means is that I don't have any level of free will over the actions I'm making. I don't get to choose the words that I'm saying at this very moment. The second argument is associations. If I smell a steak cooking, I get hungry even though I guess Andrew wrote this. Andrew's a vegetarian. The experience of objects in the world creates qualitative impressions on the world, but we don't control what those impressions are. They're automatic. Insofar as we have instinctual things that we do not have the ability to control, and we don't necessarily have the ability to know how far those instinctual instincts move into the way our thought process and brain processes work, we don't have the ability to know that we have any level of free will and it must be determined. Third is on biology. You don't have the ability to overcome the essential level and brain chemistry that you have. This means that it is more likely true that what you are doing is completely determined by biology. Fourth, all of the arguments for contingency also cross-apply and prove determinism, because if everything must have a cause, then the thing that I'm doing right now must have been caused by something else that I don't necessarily have control over. Fourth, the argument for God also proves, or fifth, the argument for God also proves this, because insofar as there is something outside of me that has put everything into existence, and that individual or that being has some level of plan or essence that is guiding me to some end, that I don't have any level of free will. How does this prove essence? Determinism proves that there is an essence that humans have through time. Therefore, there is some end that we are fulfilling regardless of the consciousness that we have. This also kills the link into any level of gov argumentation saying that we have the ability to determine something for ourselves in the first place. Because if we don't have the ability to determine some essence, then the existence that we have just doesn't matter in the first place. I said there would be two arguments, but there's a third one. We encounter meaning in the world. Couple warrants for why. First, there's no link into why us valuing something necessitates its value. They have to prove that there is some level of value to me deciding that I care about the end of this round. Otherwise, there is no meaning in the world at all. Second, there's no value because we perceive value regardless of whether or not it exists. This means that you can't actually prove that we don't that value is something that is purely subjective by just appealing to the fact that we have subjective preferences, because it doesn't actually refute the idea that there could be some level of essence out there. This takes out all of the links on the Prague in the second argument about all the reasons why we might not be able to determine what the essence of our existence is, but nonetheless, we are likely to have one on case. They tell us first, on the fill argument, they give us a bunch of reasons why God doesn't exist. Note that none of these arguments actually prove that God cannot exist, but at the very least, that God maybe doesn't likely exist. Also, all of these arguments are path-dependent on believing that the existence of God that actually exists is like the Christian God who doesn't want to put evil into the world, who is fundamentally good. We don't think you have to buy into that conception of God to buy the entire op. At that point, I think we're still winning the round. Evil can exist, and God can be in the gaps and the things that we can't explain. Also, a conception of a watchmaker God that is just put the world in motion solves this argument as well. They tell us that the purpose of philosophy is to lead us to outcomes. This is path dependent on the debate, because if there is an essence and purpose that is prior, then we do care about the philosophical truth that exists. Proud to oppose.
All the pleasantries and then whatnot. First of all, thank you to the tournament. It's been a really lovely time. I'm exhausted, but I've had a really fun time. The judging has been excellent. Everything has ran really well. And I really appreciate y'all's effort in putting into a tournament that I think everyone has genuinely enjoyed a lot. Secondly, thank you to our opponents. I love talking with y'all. Y'all are some of the most awesome people in APTA, and I'm really excited about this round. Thirdly, thank you to Ahmad. You're the reason I do this activity. You got me into it, and you're the reason I keep doing it. Thank you so much for how smart you are, how good you are, how nice you are, all of it. It means the world to me. And lastly, thank you to my judges for staying so late and for hopefully, hope you think this round is fine. Good. Or something. Okay. All right. Is everyone good?
The
LOC was a really great speech for a motion that is not the motion we are debating today. The motion is not this house believes that there is no essence or that existentialism comes first, but this house supports the narrative. The procedural question beats out all of their arguments on capital T truth being important, etc. Because even if those arguments are true, they are true for a different motion. The constitution of what actually debate is in the first place comes prior to all of their offense, because they've conceded that debate is a very fallible truth-testing mechanism, as much as there's been thousands of years of consideration of these questions that haven't gone anywhere, and probably that 4 college students aren't able to resolve these kinds of questions. So the ability to have a stable debate on the same ground comes prior to all of these questions, because it's the reason as to why we are doing the activity in the first place, and the reason as to why we can articulate this specific motion. If they can just debate whatever motion they want, that's great, but it makes it literally impossible for us to debate them structurally, because you're forced to deal with whatever interpretation they so choose on that day. But even if the procedural argument isn't true, and it is just conceded and it is just true, why do we still win? Because the first thing they say is, well, this only matters if there is capital T truth. The argument we made is not that there isn't a capital T truth, it's that a capital T truth doesn't matter. There's a couple of reasons as to why that's true. One, we can believe things that are true as to actually affect us negatively. There's sometimes where learning the truth is very bad for us, and we ought not do that if it's a question of what this house actually supports. Secondly, and more importantly, I think that we give you conceded arguments on the VMC that they just have to answer about why this form of truth testing doesn't establish any capital T truth. If the burden for doing anything is knowing the truth, this round will never figure out the truth about any of these things. That is a structural impediment that is just fundamentally impossible to overcome, meaning that their paradigm has set a very high of a bar for themselves as well. The third thing I'm going to say in this, the third thing I'm going to say here is our is prepositional. Why? Because the argument that we give you is that the reason why people do philosophy in the first place is to understand the good. So in order to even get to the people who are able to truth test, who are able to talk about these issues, you have to understand philosophy as being articulated to a notion of the good. Otherwise, it is seen as useless and masturbatory. The argument that they make is that no one gives a shit, so this house supports doesn't matter. Incorrect. The argument we made is not that you have to adopt specific philosophies that are co-opted by people. It is that people operate along certain assumptions of what the world ought to look like. Even if those aren't kind of drawn from the academy directly, they do still exist in our world, i.e., what is my meaning? What are my nature? Are questions that humans do struggle with, even if no one theoretically gives a shit about your undergraduate philosophy class. So given that that is the case, it probably is still possible for us to consider these questions in a real way, even if there is no one gives a shit. Okay, on God is real. Couple of things here. The first thing is that they beat themselves when they answer the on case. Why do they do that? Because they tell you it's probably likely is a watchmaker God. Watchmaker gods mean that humans have absolutely no essence. Why? Couple of things here. One, we just exist in a broader paradigm in which everything is already predetermined. There's nothing that is actually real about us. Ascribing words onto that is useless, because the only reason we define things as being bad is because we could have done something better on the counterfactual. But if we cannot have done something better, because it's already predetermined and God has already set us into that motion, then nothing is bad, nothing is even anything. So we have no essence just axiomatically. The second argument I'm going to make on why this also takes out their meaning argument is that if God is just letting us do whatever we want, then probably the actions that we do are still things that we can draw meaning from. This is why I think the determinism argument simply doesn't answer our offense. There's a couple of levels as to why this is necessarily true. Firstly, is that the fact that we are constituted as amalgams of atoms and chemicals, which are in fact which are arranged in predetermined ways, doesn't mean we are defined as such. There's a difference between constitution and definition, i.e., the act of ascribing a meaning onto that fact. Even if our actions are in fact predetermined, we can still make those actions as things that define people. Like even if I was already going to give this speech 5 minutes ago, the fact that I gave this speech still does define me in some action, as compared to the fact that I was going to give this speech 5 minutes ago doesn't see anything meaningful about my actual essence. It just predicts my actions. It's just not the same thing as their arguments. But secondly, I think determinism isn't true. Why? I think that Schrodinger's principle just means that we cannot determine what the position of a speed of an electron, for example, which just indicates that there's a level of fundamental uncertainty in the world that introduced to the principle of randomness in all kinds of actions, and the determinism probably is incorrect on an analytical level. On the God is real arguments, I think more specifically, the first thing to say is that there has to be a maximal set of attributes. Okay, this just means that God is not real. Why? Because can God solve a puzzle? Can God create a puzzle which God cannot solve? If the answer is yes, then God is not omnipotent. If the answer is no, then God is also not omnipotent. Omnipotence is just an incoherent theory on face. I think that second of all, the fact that having a maximal amount of attributes doesn't mean that God necessarily has to be real. Like, I don't really understand this argument. It seems like kind of Phil Sludge to me, but I just don't understand necessarily why it is true that they have to have this many attributes. The second thing they say is that there has to be an ontological beginning to this question. I think that one, it's probably not true. Things can go infinitely far back. They're not giving you any structural reasons why the infinite and something comes before everything has to exist. That is to say, that they just say the Big Bang is fast because something has to have come before. But it's possible for infinite somethings to have happened before. And it's mathematically true that infinity does exist. And these are real concepts that can exist. Time can have gone infinitely far back. There's no reason why something has to proceed that they've actually proven. Secondly, we're just going to make the argument that scientific rigor is probably a good thing. Saying that Big Bang is false and stupid probably is wrong because people have done far more exploration and far more studying of these things, and if people resolve all these questions in ways that are realistically testable as compared to just philosophical I say word, you say word, we kind of figure out what word is better, it probably is true that there isn't a God in fact and that these things aren't deterministic. The next thing they say is that nothing comes from nothing. I answered this argument before. It doesn't have to come from nothing. It has to come from something that is created before, which can go infinitely far back, as they've not proven an argument as to why infinity cannot in fact go infinitely far back. On the Pascal's wager, a pre-fiat argument, guys, what is this? Couple of things here. Firstly, this is not an argument for the truth of God. If capital T truth is all we care about, then the fact of you going to heaven or not is prerequisited by the fact of there being a God, in fact, that has determined that truth. So they're framing nice in here. Two, Pascal's is wrong, because there's infinitely many gods constituted by infinitely many religions, and believing and one of them just damns you to hell in another one. So there's just no reason to be ability to take any kind of action. You can turn this pre-fiat argument, because it's just that no action can ever be taken for the risk that you get damned by some amount of gods, which is, if there is a pre-fiat ballot here, probably goes gov, but please don't. Okay. The next argument they make is that, the next argument they make is that if God exists, he gives us an essence. No, God doesn't have to give you an essence. God can just create you and let you go. I don't understand necessarily the missing link between God and essence being there. I think the fact that God creates you does not mean that there necessarily is an essence. They said that what constitution must come from something. This has been already earlier. There's no reason as why something can't come up before that thing. And we've in fact mathematically proven that infinity does just exist. So there's no reason as why these claims are inherently true. The next thing they say is that the arguments for contingency must have something that comes before them. That is to say, the determinism is true because something has happened before that thing. That thing can also have been determined. This argument is just infinitely regressive, and just calling ours infinitely regressive is not an actual answer to the argument, which is fundamentally that we can take actions that, of course, they impact our future actions, but there's still things that we can do. The argument that we make on the PMC is that even if we do bad things, we can rectify those bad things, that those things, in fact, do give us meaning. They say that this takes it to pragmatic offense because, if there's determined, then it doesn't matter. This fundamentally misunderstands our argument. Our argument is that adopting a narrative is meaningful, even if that narrative is incorrect or whatever, which I don't think it is. It doesn't matter because the fact that someone believes that they couldn't define their existence causes them to take certain actions, even if those actions are predetermined, etc. So there is no reason why this takes up the prag, and they're just on a huge time gap on the prag. So I suspect if you buy the framing, you're probably going to be voting gov in this debate. Okay. Onto the on case. They say the argument we made is not that that God cannot exist. I think we give you warrants. They say just that it's really unlikely. Guys, we are just operating fundamentally in a field of probabilities here. Nothing can be 100% certain on this question. So if you prove that God is just structurally less likely to exist, then you probably win. The reason why God, who they say just Christian God is all that matters here. No, it's not, because we told you that God has an attempt to reveal himself, if there is in fact an essence. Why? Because if God is in any way benevolent, then the fact that you have an essence is something they want to reveal to you. If they're in any way malevolent, they want to cause you to stray away from that essence. And if they don't care, they wouldn't create an essence in the first place. So the idea of the essence is prepositional to the fundamental question of our argument, and means that necessarily God then has to be relevant. And then the argument about this doesn't have to be the Christian God, I also answered this earlier as to the watchmaking God just being a very, very good gov ballot in this debate, because watchmaking gods don't really matter. Also, I think that watchmaking God probably answers some of their bottom level arguments on determinism, because even if everything is predetermined, that just means there is no meaning, and the actions that we take in fact do constitute something relevant. That's why I'm so proud to propose.
Is there a charger under here? Oh, there is actually. Pleasantries, as always, it's fun debating all. I don't know where this whole true friends on SideGov thing comes from, but true friends on SideGov, yeah. Thank you for putting on the tournament. Thanks to the novices who just walked back into the room, who I know procured alcohol for me later. And finally, let's get started. I don't give a shit. Viv, we had a great time. All right, is anyone not ready? So, I'm gonna be real with you. There's not gonna be an order. It's just gonna be paper. Just get out paper.
Hold on, let me see.
Wait, actually, I need a second. Everyone good?
Yeah, we're good.
I'm not going to let the one chance I have to genuinely debate real philosophy and apta go down the drain and just let them win on pragmatic arguments. I genuinely think that Ale is actually mishandling the truth argument, and I understand there's an aversion in this activity to voting on generics, but I think if I win this on the flow in a round which is primarily about philosophy, we should then win this as a framing. What is the argument we give you? We say that truth comes prior because in order to evaluate the flow, it presupposes that truth has meaning. What is the response we get? The response Ale gives us just gets the sequencing. Because his response is, oh, but the procedural ability to evaluate the flow comes prior to capital T truth, insofar as the fact that we've always disagreed necessarily means we are not going to reach a conclusion. But this mixes up the sort of sequencing question. Because in order to say that capital T truth does not exist, you presuppose that the sentence capital T truth does not exist has semantic meaning, which is accessible to you as a judge. What that means is that in order to evaluate the flow from a procedural perspective, you necessarily presuppose that language itself has some degree of value, or at least has some degree of value beyond the arbitrary preferences you apply. Why do you necessarily also prefer this under the procedural question if for some reason you are buying the actual analysis? Because that just means debate is fucking arbitrary on their side of the house, because they're just conceding that the procedural question comes prior to capital T truth, which means there's no actual way of determining which is procedurally correct. That then means that you just get an activity in which it is purely arbitrary and there's no actual way of determining the winner. This beats them on that layer because A, it just causes a lack of engagement with the activity because people don't want to do it if it's effectively a coin flip. I'd rather sit around just sort of coin flipping infinitely online. But B, I just think they're conceding the logical warranting above about why truth comes first. The second layer under this is the burdens claim and that Vivienne gives you, which is insofar as it's the case that truth necessarily comes first, they then have to win a positive reason why their claim is true in order to win the round. It is not sufficiently enough for them to say that theoretically a narrative in which people support this thing would be better if we just win that such a narrative itself is incoherent because it literally does not have truth value on the semantic level of the flow. If we win that, we win the round. Why then are we winning that all of their arguments are necessarily incoherent? All right, final response to this. They say that people struggle with these questions all the time. The problem is this is not actual proof that we are incapable of determining an answer. And secondly, it just proves that truth itself is valuable because, again, they're asking you the question of people struggling with these things, which necessarily means, again, presuppose semantic truth value. Okay, whatever. At that point then, why are we winning that their case is just untrue? If we win a single positive reason, we beat them. If they fail to prove a positive reason, we beat them. On the idea of God, they say that a watchmaker God presupposes there's no human essence. First, Viv never told you a watchmaker God is necessary. They have to win that conception. Viv just gives you an example of a watchmaker God. Second, this is not the case and also non-topical because all we have to prove is that essence or meaning, even if it is not human essence or meaning, exists prior to human experience, i.e. if we prove there is some essence, which is a necessary condition by which humans have experience to begin with, then we are necessarily winning that that essence is prior to human experience and that it is impossible to retroactively define that essence through experience because all experience presupposes essence. At that point, what is the easiest place that it is just round ending at the top? It's the argument about first causes in thoughts. Our argument is that every thought necessarily is caused by another thought, but that's infinitely regressive. So there must be a thought which pops into existence and has no cause. Because that thought is not a logical thing, it is merely something which exists, it is not something we determine through living, it is not existence. It is a deep structure, a deep cognitive structure of the mind, which is the analysis that we get from Vivienne. Why does this matter? Look, the only thing that's vaguely responsive to this claim is always saying that, oh, we've discovered infinity in math, so infinitely regressive must be fine. But the problem is this concedes the actual logic, which is that in order to make any claim, it presupposes certain facts about the world, correct? And those facts in turn presuppose other facts about the world. If it is the case that this is indeed infinitely regressive, and that's fine as all A claims, that everything presupposes something else, everything is circular, everything collapses. However, in order to evaluate capital T truth, as we told you, or even just to evaluate the semantic truth, rather, which comes prior to everything, you have to believe there is a first cause. That's the analysis, but secondly, I think we're just winning that first causes logically exist. Insofar as that is the case, what does this mean? It means that all logic presupposes a deep cognitive structure which simply exists. It does not exist because of a predicate. It does not exist because of a reason we determine through life. It merely exists. Every thought, every piece of the rational process is contingent on these first uncaused thoughts. Insofar as that is true, we are just winning. There is something intrinsic about human beings which is necessary in order for human beings to have experience. Second conceded argument. This is really important. Look, even if it is the case that everything they say is correct, all this science jargon, all this stuff on the flow, they're conceding the one warrant that just takes out their entire case. It's at the bottom, it's from Vivienne, it's that experience comes prior because we evaluate the flow through experience. What that means is that if I experience value in the world, this is necessarily better proof of value existing out there than any argument they give you on the flow about that. All right, why? Because we evaluate these arguments on the flow through our subjective perception of reality, which means everything collapses to what we experience. Why do we experience value in the world, and why do we experience it as something which is outside of our perspective? First, I'm gonna appeal to your experience here. You go see some fireworks, you have like a first kiss, or you fall in love. What you experience here is something exterior to your own personhood. I think we all know this is true. I think we all know this is something we are capable of. It is the reason we value other people in this room. Not because I have subjective reasons to value you, but because I experience you as a subject of value in the external world. Not because I impose value on the world, but because value exists in the world, and I know that through experience. I know that through the lives I live and the words I speak, and you know that too. And they've conceded that. What that means is it kills their entire case. Because they've conceded that something exists out there in the world which is not determined through our subjective preferences, which is not determined through existence, which is necessarily prior to that. All right, let's move on to the stuff about God, just in case that Viv wants to go for this. All right, on the idea of God. They said that scientific Big Bang is much better, or first on the idea of sort of infinitely regressive stuff. One, I think I already just sort of beat this argument when I tell you that infinitely regressive is still logically predicate, right? Even if it's the case that there's a logical sort of infinity in numbers, that doesn't matter because numbers just wrap around, they're imaginary concepts. We tell you that everything in the physical world is contingent, and that necessarily speaking, the universe cannot be contingent on itself because this is incoherent because it must have a cause external to itself. At that point, they're conceding that there's necessarily a cause which itself is uncaused. Why is that true? This A comes prior to all the stuff about Pascal's wager, because even if it's the case that there's theoretically some theological God that might exist out there and causes some degree of pain, if we just win that logically some substance exists which is prior to all experience, we are winning under the truth-telling conception of the round. Why does this come prior to your obligation as a judge? Because your ability to believe in hell to begin with presupposes the truth value of the words of hell, etc., etc. You already get the weighing here. But secondly, I also just think it's the case that, whatever. All right. On the other arguments, they say, can God create a puzzle he can't solve? Yeah, he's God. They say, but stuff can go back infinitely. I already dealt with that. They say the scientific Big Bang is better. One, this just proves our argument, because the Big Bang must have had a cause, and insofar as they're saying the Big Bang existed, that cause must have been uncaused, it's God. On the idea of Pascal's wager, I think I already sort of up-layered this before, but Ali's rebuttal on Pascal's wager doesn't prove that you should not assume there is a God. It just assumes there is some risk that also damns you to hell, which means that if we actually win, there's a positive reason to believe there's a God, i.e. there's positive reason to believe that there's some degree of essence outside of experience, we win. Why then are we winning this? Because the key concession they're making is that God isn't just the causal predicate to everything. God is the ontological predicate for everything. That means every fucking concept presupposes God, because every concept itself must have a predicate, and those predicates have predicates, and that predicate is God. Therefore, the fact that they are arguing against us, the fact that they employ language, and the fact that you are capable of understanding that language just proves our point that God exists. They conceded that. Then, what does that mean? It means there must be essence, because God is essence, because existence itself must be contingent on a thing which is defined only in itself and does not appeal to other values. What that therefore means is that God is essence itself, and that and that sort of the idea of human existence, even if you don't believe that God is essence, presupposes some deeper ontological form of existence, which necessarily means they just do not win any of the argumentation that they give. For those reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
Take your time. Good. When Ahmad ends PMC, when Ale ends MG, and they both tell you to vote Gov, when they stand up in PMC and MG and they make arguments to you, they concede the logically prior truth claim that says that the only reason that you have any way to vote or adjudicate this round is because you value the inherent truth that exists on the flow. If you're willing to vote Gov at all, you have to concede the top-level framework that says that truth matters and it is a priori to anything else in this round. At the point in which you're buying that, you end up buying the entire set of framework that I give you at the top. If we care about truth at all, we need to care about what the underlying existential truth of the arguments that we make are. What does this mean for the procedural question of this debate? I think MG grossly mishandles the burden push that we give you. We tell you that in order to prove that you ought to support something, the government team has to prove that it is factually true, otherwise we ought to take no position at all. What that means is that the only burden we have to prove in this round is that there is some risk that God exists, there is some risk that determinism is true, at which point we think you ought to take no position on the motion rather than saying that we ought to support something that is factually not true. This, yeah?
I might be missing this. I don't think the argument that we should take no position is in this debate. Maybe I missed it from PM.
I read that directly from LOC.
I do have that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It was copy-pasted.
Each member of the panel will take it under consideration.
Eli stealing chair powers.
Oh, sorry, am I not supposed to do that? This is my first time doing that stuff.
I don't
No,
know.
on the panel, we might have different opinions potentially theoretically.
Sorry about that.
Cool.
Might be.
You know where Eli stands, but the other one.
Great. Eli will pull for me. Cool. Therefore, the first place you're voting is on God. Why is this sufficient to disprove the truth claim that's in the motion? They tell us first that the watchmaker God is not going to be sufficient to do that. Here's why that's not the case. Because first, it proves the determinism claim is true. Even if God is not one that is prescribing us some plan in the Christian theological way, that God has still determined the entire path of existence insofar as it is a prior cause to everything else. It cuts off randomness from the ballot that they have, because the note that the warrant that they give you is that the Big Bang happened, which introduces the randomness in the first place. If that's not the case, then we do have access to all of the determinism claims. But also, insofar as there is an existence that exists outside of humanity, we also fulfill the gov burden that they give us at the very top. We just need to prove that God exists. That's why they spend the first minute of PMC giving rebuttal on this claim. But I think we prove the even higher burden. We prove that God exists in the 3-0 God way. A couple warrants that don't get handled correctly to prove this. First, the ontological proof. The literal only response to this argument is the idea that this is philosophical gobbledygook. I gave you the warrants out of LOC. The reason why the ontological proof works is because insofar as we can imagine the existence of a God that has the capacity to be 3-0, it means that that being must necessarily exist, because no contingent fact about the world would be able to constrain the existence of a maximally great being. The very fact that we can imagine that one would exist proves this argument. Also, Pasquale's wager does win. The reason is because Ole's argument doesn't actually prove the risk calculus for you, right? If it is true that you could get damned to hell for believing in a Christian God, that is okay, because on their side of the house, if you don't believe in a God at all, you have a 100% chance of being damned to hell because you have no access to any level of faith that would get you access to heaven in the first place. But on our side of the house, you at least have a 1% chance that if the Christian God is real, you do gain access to that argument. What's the weighing here? First, risk of God proves that there is some essence outside of existence, and insofar as we prove to you pre-fiat you ought to believe it, I think you just vote for us right there. But the second ballot is on determinism. This is the cleanest ballot in the round. Ole's rebuttal doesn't actually prove that determinism doesn't exist, that you do have free will. Instead it just proves that some level of determinism, there isn't actually a rebuttal here, right? Here's how determinism also wins us the round. Note that the motion tells us that a nature that is inherent in human existence, an essence, is sufficient to be voting up here. At that point, the warrant level that we give you on determinism, that there is a temporal essence of humanity, an end that we are moving towards, proves the motion false. So proud to oppose.
3, 2. No ink on the flow about narratives. If we are winning the procedural question about narratives, we win the round de facto. I'm going to extend 2 links on why this is true. 1, that you exclude people through these narratives, and 2, that there's decision paralysis, you cannot find meaning. Any of these things when you vote here because there's no response. A couple of reasons why the procedural argument is true. First, the only thing we need to win on the procedural question is not that truth doesn't exist. We agree that truth exists, so their arguments about rendering things incoherent doesn't mean anything. We just need to win that if things are untrue, they can still be good. That is, the answer to if it is not true, it's not coherent, is no. There's no such thing as truth. That is the answer they have to give you. That is what is incoherent. If I lie to someone in a way that makes them feel good, that is perfectly coherent and does create positive outcomes, which we can then evaluate as such, even though it is untrue. That is the argument conceded from MG. This takes out the argument about how the truth being key to the flow. If I was going to get run over by a bus and lose the round, the judges know that, but if op wins on the flow, it's still bad that they cause us to die. Also, there's a procedural question here on temporality, because note that the truth testing they talk about only exists within the round. That is, we are hypothesis testing within the world of the round. The truth that exists only within the round, which means the prior question to that is how we evaluate the round. That is, how we evaluate the procedures of the round via the motion. Narrative. Cool.
This is somewhat precautionary. The argument that says that we are evaluating truth claims exclusively in the round, I think, is new.
No, that's the argument made in the MG, that the LOC set a far too high of a bar. If the argument made in the LOC is like, we should evaluate truth claims generically, the round just collapses into nothing because it's impossible for us to get to that level. So we should evaluate things within the round as being true.
Yeah.
Cool.
Also, I will say the specific articulation that I'm giving here, maybe the new words, it's the same articulation, which is that the prior question is the motion, because that's how we create the truth testing world.
Are you withdrawing the point of order, or?
No.
I mean, like,
I'm sure y'all have what you need.
Okay.
I didn't catch all that. Can you repeat
Sure.
that?
So the argument I made is that the LOC sets out too high a burden, because if we have to find capital T truth broadly in the world for this motion, we cannot do so, so we should default to notions of truth within the round.
Yeah. And the notions of truth are what the motion turns out to be true, or proving the motion. Cool. 3, 2. Second, on the idea of taking no action. They say that we ought to take no action, but what does this actually mean? There's no impact to this. It is not true that we ought to take no action. We give you arguments, in fact, that action can create good things. Necessarily, then, it means that at best, you take no action on the fill, and you move to the narrative arguments that we tell you also exist in the round. This ends around on face. The second thing they have conceded is that the only reason why philosophy exists at all and be considered by people is the fact that it is able to consider what is good or create some conception of how we move towards the good. This turns our argument about the truth, because if truth testing is the highest order of value, then you should adopt the philosophical approach that best enables the exploration of the truth. The philosophical approach, then, is a question of what is good and how we get to the good. If we do this, we outweigh on scope. Even if the debate could find the truth, which is their only response to the idea that it is unlikely to do so, so could tons of other things, and they say we ought to take an approach that best enables truth testing, i.e. enables the idea of the good, that is, which narrative comes first, or which narrative is the best. This also ends around on the weighing level. The third thing that we are winning here is a procedural question. You literally have not answered the argument that when the motion asks about the narrative, it asks about the narrative and not their argument. It turns our office into the only mechanism through which we can truth test and how this is made at all is if we have a stable point of clash. We necessarily create worse truth testing in a world where we do not have clash and it is arbitrary, we do not understand or can predict the arguments that come around. Because there's no way for us to truth test on a common ground if we don't have a common ground. But since the common ground itself is the narrative, that is what the motion prescribes, then that becomes what we truth test against. Next, what we're going to tell you here beyond this is on the idea of God. Because what I've proven to you firstly is that if you're buying a procedural question about narratives, then in the 2 links I extended are sufficient to vote because there's no response. But if we also win the arguments on God, you don't even have to evaluate there. Firstly, and very critically, is they misunderstand the argument about essence. Because what we tell you here is that just because there is something that is a God or something that existed before, does not necessarily prescribe essence onto people. They say, but this is what the motion tells us to do. No, the motion talks about how their existence has to precede essence that claims that human beings have no necessary nature, purpose, or meaning. This is important because it means that the essence is specific to how human beings are created and operated through. That is, even if in their best case there is some prescribed essence to a deity or a thing that creates, it doesn't create humans with the essence, it is still sufficient to vote God. Secondarily, and more importantly here then, a couple of responses. One, they don't actually prove an argument for why essence is necessary to determinism or essence is necessary to God. Why? They drop the argument that if it is true that we give an essence to humans, that God will reveal himself to us. Either A, because he is good and wants us to follow in the name of the essence, or B, that he is bad and he will harm us to follow away from the essence. But since neither has happened, it means that necessarily he cannot be true, or that if he is true, he has not imbued us with essence. The second argument argument is an ontological one. They give you a response that because we can think of something that's cosmologically prior, it means that there's a God. But guys, if you want to make this argument, you need to respond to the preamp that happens at the top of PMC. That preamp being that we need to create a clear and distinct image of God. That is the exact wording of the PMC, which means that we give you the framework through which you can create an ontological understanding of God. But they have not proven to you a clear or distinct metric for God, thus ontologically God cannot exist. You lose their battle there. Next thing to talk about then is on Pascal's wager. They just misunderstand Ollie's argument. There are infinite gods, and they all do infinite things with regard to how you do action or inaction. It means that any action you take has an equally infinite chance of sending you to hell or heaven, so you cannot defer to this because there's no action you can take under a Pascal's paradigm that leads you to positive action. But this also doesn't mean you have to believe in a God, because there can still exist entities that say if you believe, you die, or if you believe, you die and go to hell, thus there is no entity you can believe in, which means that this doesn't preclude an idea of the God, or even if it does, it's preclude an idea of the God that creates essence. Next thing to talk about is burden analysis. I already talked about this earlier when I say that human existence and human essence is a necessary component of the realm, not just essence broadly. This also is important for the idea of infinity, because what they tell you to know is that infinity is necessarily circular. That is, if something is infinite, it circles and collapses. The argument that they miss, though, that they need to warrant here is why the circularity creates collapse. It can't just be the case that at the end of this humanity, there's a Big Bang that starts the exact same humanity that does everything that happened already beforehand. But this is important for two reasons. One, it does not concede essence, because just because there's autonomy, autonomy that is moving doesn't mean that essence is imbued into humans or the essence of meaning is imbued into humans. It just means that things are happening. But secondly, and more importantly, they concede the argument about Schrodinger's atoms. That is, if there was randomness, it means that the randomness is a direct response to cosmology. There is no God, no determinism, so you don't vote there as a prereq. Also, an idea of infinitely. They say there's always something contingent. There's always something that's logically prior that comes before. But the issue with this argument is very clear, that even if there's always something that's contingent or always something that's before, it doesn't preclude that there has to be something that stops, i.e. a first-order mover. We tell it can be infinite, and it can always infinitely move prior. Just because they cannot conceptualize this argument doesn't mean that it's not true because they concede it. Proud.